September 13th, 1918. The morning after, along the muddy roads of the Saint-Mihiel-Salon in eastern France, German prisoners are walking to the rear in long gray columns. By the time this battle ends, there will be 16,000 of them. Behind those columns, stretched across the fields they just surrendered, sits the thing that was supposed to make this morning impossible. Belt after belt of barbed wire, 4 years of it, some of the deepest defensive entanglements anywhere on the Western Front. And here is the detail that would not fit inside a single German officer's head. Long stretches of that wire were still standing. It had not been blasted into scrap by a week of shelling. It had not been chewed into ribbons by days of methodical cutting fire. In places, it looked almost untouched. Yet the American infantry was on the wrong side of it, the German side, and had gotten there in hours. For 4 years, every defender in this salient had known one thing the way you know gravity. An attack through wire announces itself. Days of bombardment, ranging shots walking toward your trench, gaps appearing in the belts like missing teeth, warnings layered on warnings. That knowledge had kept German soldiers alive at the Somme and at Verdun. It was the closest thing trench warfare had to a law of physics. On September 12, 1918, that law simply stopped working. Before this battle, German assessments of the American soldier used a specific word, and it is documented in their own records: amateurs. After this battle, a senior German commander described what happened here as a severe defeat, and the reports quietly rewrote their opinion of the men they had faced. But there was one thing those reports never managed to explain to their own satisfaction: how infantry, plain infantry, on foot, in the rain, in the dark, crossed obstacles that were engineered to be uncrossable without a ritual of destruction that never took place. Because the answer wasn't a machine. It wasn't a secret weapon. It was something far more unsettling. It was an idea about time. Today we're going to run the full forensic audit of that morning. Not the museum version, the mechanism. You're going to see exactly what the belts were really selling, why every army on Earth kept paying for them in the same currency, and why one army walked up to the counter and refused. And when we are done, the German bafflement will make perfect sense, because you will see that they were not lying and they were not stupid. They were measuring the right obstacle with the wrong instrument. To understand how 500,000 men crossed the strongest obstacle belts in Lorraine without performing the one ceremony every army on Earth believed was mandatory, we need to go back first briefly to a farm county in Illinois, then to the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army, because the story of how the Americans crossed the wire begins with the story of why nobody else could. Barbed wire is an American invention. In November 1874, a farmer named Joseph Glidden received a patent, famously nicknamed the Winner, for twisted fencing wire studded with barbs. And within a generation, his product had fenced an entire continent of cattle country. It was cheap, it was fast to string, and it had one property that would matter enormously 40 years later. It punished any living thing that tried to push through it in a hurry. When the European armies dug in across France in the autumn of 1914, they reached for Glidden's invention almost immediately. But here is what most people get wrong about its military role, and it is the single most important idea in this entire story. The entanglements in front of a trench were never really there to stop an attack. They were there to slow it and to steer it. Belts were laid at angles that funneled assaulting infantry into lanes. And at the end of every lane sat a machine gun that had been aimed there weeks in advance. A man tangled in the strands wasn't blocked. He was scheduled, held in the open, upright, struggling for the seconds a gunner needed. So the obstacle's real product was not steel resistance, it was time. Seconds for the machine gunners, minutes for the sentries, hours, even days for the defending generals. And that created the cruelest trait in military history. To attack, you first had to destroy the belts, and destroying them told the enemy exactly where and roughly when you were coming. Look at what that trade cost. Before the Somme offensive in the summer of 1916, British guns hammered the German lines for a full week, hurling roughly 1.5 million shells, much of it aimed at cutting the entanglements. One British machine gunner who survived those weeks wrote bitterly that shell fire merely lifts wire up and drops it down, often leaving a worse tangle than before. He was right. On the morning of July 1st, 1916, the Newfoundland Regiment advanced toward gaps that the bombardment was supposed to have opened. The gaps were few, and the German gunners who had spent that entire week counting the days in their deep dugouts, warned by every shell, had aimed at them. The men who reached the belts died trying to snip through them with hand cutters. Before sunset, more than 19,000 British soldiers were dead. It remains the worst single day the British Army has ever suffered. Think about the mechanism there, because it is the mechanism of this whole war. The week of shelling was not just a failed demolition, it was a 7-day telegram to the defenders. We are coming here soon. The obstacle did its job before a single attacker touched it by forcing the attacker to announce himself. Why couldn't shell fire simply erase the belts? Physics. An entanglement is mostly empty space. A high explosive shell that would flatten a brick wall passes its blast straight through a lattice of strands, tosses it, and sets it back down. Displaced, snarled, but still functional. To genuinely shred a deep belt, you needed staggering quantities of precisely observed fire, which meant days, which meant the telegram again. And the defenders never stopped maintaining their side of the bargain. Night after night, on both sides of no man's land, wiring parties crawled out in the dark to repair their own entanglements and sabotage the enemy's. One of the most hated duties of the war done at a whisper, because the whole system only worked if the barrier stayed whole. An obstacle that heals itself every night, punishes every attempt to cross it, and screams a warning whenever someone tries to remove it at scale. That is what 4 years of industrialized warfare had built. Yes, eventually machines entered the argument. The tank was invented quite literally to crush paths through entanglements. And by August 1918 at Amiens, massed armor showed it could do exactly that. But tanks in 1918 were rare, slow, mechanically fragile, and helpless in deep mud. And as we will see at Saint-Mihiel, the mud would sideline them again and again at the worst moments. Whatever crossed the belts in this story would have to be able to do it on 2 feet in the rain. Keep that in mind because it kills the easiest explanation before the Germans ever reach for it. Every army internalized this. French doctrine, British doctrine, German doctrine. All of them treated the belts as something to be destroyed in advance and accepted the announcement as the unavoidable price. By 1918, a German soldier in a quiet sector could sleep soundly behind his entanglements for a simple reason. Any attack big enough to matter would be loud enough and long enough to hear coming. The obstacle was his alarm clock as much as his shield. Nowhere was that sleep deeper than in the Saint-Mihiel salient, a wedge of occupied France, roughly 200 square miles, that the Germans had held since September 1914. 4 years in one place. 4 years of stringing, layering, thickening the belts in front of 3 successive defensive zones. On German maps, the obstacle system of Army Detachment C was a masterpiece of density. Hold on to that word, density, because the entire German catastrophe hides inside it. In the late summer of 1918, a brand new army was studying those same maps. And in its planning rooms, American officers were having an argument that would have sounded insane in any other headquarters in Europe. An argument about whether to skip the announcement entirely. What they decided in that room is the reason German interrogation reports from this battle read like the testimony of men describing something they watched happen and still do not believe. The American First Army was 11 days old when it took responsibility for the Saint-Mihiel sector. Formed on August 10, 1918, it was the first independent American field army in Europe, a thing General John J. Pershing had fought his own allies to create. Marshal Foch tried almost to the last moment to break it apart and feed its divisions into French armies. Pershing's answer, recorded in the accounts of that meeting, was blunt. Most assuredly, but as an American army, and in no other way. He got his battle. Now he had to win it with an army that had never fought as an army. Look at the target through their eyes for a moment. The salient was not one line, but a layered system. A forward defensive zone, 8 kilometers deep, called the Wilhelm Line, an interior position known as the Schroeder Line, and across the base, tied into the Hindenburg system itself, the fortified Michael Line. Between the American trenches and the first German ones rose Munzek, A hill the defenders had honeycombed with tunnels from which their observers had watched every French move since 1914. Attacking here meant walking uphill in the open into a fortress that could see you coming through some of the deepest obstacle belts in France. This was the ground the new army chose for its debut. The plan came together at Ligny-en-Barrois under men like Colonel Hugh Drum and a young staff officer named George C. Marshall. Yes, that Marshall, the future architect of victory in the Second World War. Then a lieutenant colonel moving 500,000 men on paper. The numbers alone were staggering. More than 500,000 troops, some 3,000 guns, 200,000 tons of supplies converging on a 65-kilometer front. But buried inside all that logistics was one decision that mattered more than every other, and it concerned the entanglements. How long should the guns fire before the infantry went forward? The conventional answer, the Somme answer, the answer 4 years of warfare had written in blood, was days. Chew the belts apart, accept the announcement. Some proposals on the American side pushed in the opposite direction entirely. No preliminary bombardment at all. Total surprise and trust the infantry to deal with the obstacles as they found them. The argument ran for weeks. Pershing ended it with a number: 4 hours. No more. Understand what that number actually was. It was a bet, a wager of thousands of lives on a doctrine the American army had been preaching half in the wilderness since it arrived in France. Open warfare. The belief that infantry should move, adapt, and solve obstacles in stride rather than wait for artillery to sterilize the ground ahead of them. 4 hours would be long enough to smash German batteries and command posts to stun and blind the defense. It was nowhere near long enough to destroy the wire. And that was the point. The wire would not be destroyed. It would be crossed by the assault itself in motion. So the breaching tools were folded into the attacking waves. Teams of infantrymen carried long-handled cutters. Engineers moved with them, carrying Bangalore torpedoes, explosive-packed pipes that could be shoved under an entanglement and fired to blow a lane in seconds, not days. The cutting, where cutting was needed, would happen during the assault under the barrage at the pace of a running man. The ranging shots and the killing blow would arrive as the same event. Nothing about this attack would resemble the pattern the defenders had spent 4 years learning to read. Armor was part of the equation too. Some 400 tanks, most of them light French-built Renaults, including 2 American battalions under a hard-driving lieutenant colonel named George S. Patton, were assigned to grind lanes and lead the infantry where the ground allowed. But the planners trusted them only so far. Orders explicitly told the infantry not to tie themselves to the machines. If the tanks bogged in September mud, and September in the Woevre plain is a swamp with a rainy season, the riflemen would keep going without them. The crossing could not depend on anything with an engine. There was a second layer to the plan, and it was pure theater. To convince the Germans the real blow was coming somewhere else, American operators set up a fake radio network near the Belfort Gap, flooding the air with coded traffic, seasoned for authenticity with the slang and profanity German intercept stations had come to expect from American signalmen. An American major checked into a Belfort hotel known to crawl with German agents and left a crumpled sheet of carbon paper bearing plans for a fictitious offensive in his wastepaper basket. The carbon paper vanished within hours. The Germans didn't fully believe it, but they reinforced Belfort anyway, moved artillery, evacuated villages. Doubt is expensive, and here is a fact so strange it reads like fiction. None of this secrecy fully held. A Swiss newspaper actually published the date, the hour, and even the planned duration of the American bombardment before it happened. Remember that. The defenders of Saint-Mihiel were not blindsided about the calendar. They knew an attack was coming. Hold that fact next to what happened anyway, because the gap between those two things is where the answer to this video's question lives. Men like Marshall did not plan this attack for applause. Most Americans have never heard what was decided in that room or what it cost to be right about it. If the story deserves to stay in front of people who care how history actually worked, the like button is a 1-second way to keep it there. That is all it takes, and it genuinely matters. Through the night of September 11th, in cold driving rain, the assault battalions moved up. Engineer guides led them through their own obstacle belts to jumping off lines marked with white tape. and the men lay down on the soaked ground to wait. What none of them knew was what the Germans were doing at that same hour on the other side of no man's land. They were packing. Berlin had ordered the salient evacuated, and the withdrawal code named Loki had begun days earlier, which set up the strangest collision of the entire war. An attacker who refused to send a warning, advancing on a defender who was already halfway out the door, and who still, even in retreat, believed one thing was certain. Whatever came, the belts would buy him time. At exactly 0910 on September 12th, 3,000 guns opened fire at once, and men in the American trenches watched the black horizon turn into a single sheet of flame. Nature added its own artillery. A thunderstorm rolled across the salient in the middle of the bombardment. A Marine private named John Osland, watching gas shells, colored rockets, and lightning share the same sky, summed it up in his account in 3 words: "What a night." And he recorded something else, something easy to read past. Out ahead of the trenches in the dark, in no man's land, cutters were already at work on the tangled strands, quietly by hand, hours before any German would expect a lane to matter. At 05 WWII, still 20 minutes before daylight, the rolling barrage began creeping forward, 100 meters every 4 minutes, and the infantry rose out of the mud and followed it. This was the moment everything the defenders had learned since 1914 said could not be happening. The bombardment had lasted 4 hours, not 4 days. By every rule, the defenders knew this was harassment, not an offensive. There had been no week of cutting fire. The belts were intact, and the Americans walked into them anyway. What happened at the entanglements happened fast, and it happened 3 different ways at once. Where the strands were taut and dense, the breaching teams did their work in stride. Cutters snapping lanes, Bangalore torpedoes cracking open gaps in seconds, tanks grinding flat paths where the mud allowed them to move at all. But across long stretches of the front, the assault waves discovered something the German maps did not show. The wire was old. 4 years of rust, rain, and collapsing pickets had left whole bands sagging toward the earth, half swallowed by grass. Reports from that morning describe belts that looked formidable in aerial photographs lying beaten down in the field. Obstacles men could step across, trample, walk over without breaking stride. The 1st Division reported afterward that the enemy's forward positions were not difficult to pass, so demolished were they by rain and shell fire. In the 42nd Division sector, Lieutenant Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, who had privately feared the entanglements would butcher his New Yorkers, watched his breaching parties open lanes so quickly that the barrier everyone dreaded barely slowed the advance. None of this was free, and honesty requires saying so. A private from Iowa named George Moore wrote home that diving for a trench after a German machine gun opened up behind him, his foot snagged in the strands, and he went in head first, breaking 2 ribs. And in the 90th Division sector, where the belts were alive and covered by fire, a corporal named Jesse M. Gisham heard the call go out for cutters, climbed out of his hole, and walked forward. Witnesses describe him working calmly as if the battle around him were weather. He cut 1 path through, then a second. He was starting a 3rd when a machine gun burst killed him. He received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously. Crossing without cutting was the pattern of this battle. It was never the whole of it. Men like Gisham paid for the exceptions, but now flipped to the German side of those same fields because this is where the morning turned surreal. The defenders were caught in the middle of their withdrawal. Batteries were limbered up for the road, not laid for battle. Teams of horses brought forward to haul the guns out were killed in their traces by the bombardment. Withdrawal routes were blocked by craters and fallen trees. One German commander misread his withdrawal orders and left 2/3 of his infantry sitting in forward positions with almost no artillery behind them. And so as the sun came up, German soldiers who had spent the entire war being told the belts guaranteed them warning and time received neither. By 08 prisoners were streaming toward the American rear in the hundreds. In the village of Esse, a private of the 165th Infantry named Albert Ettinger watched French civilians, occupied for 4 years, weep and press what little food they had on the men who had just walked through the uncrossable. That same morning produced one of the war's strangest snapshots. Near Esse, as a German barrage crept toward a small hill, two officers stood on it, talking calmly, while everyone around them dove for cover. Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur and a tank officer named George S. Patton meeting for the first time under fire. Accounts of what they said differ. Patton, writing 4 days later, put it simply, "I met General MacArthur commanding a brigade. He was walking about too." Two future legends standing upright in the middle of a battle that was already becoming one. The salient held since 1914 was effectively sealed in about a day and a half. Through the night of the 12th, American columns raced from two directions toward the village of Vigneulles to close the trap. The 26th Division's lead elements reached the heights above it around 2 in the morning, and by 09:30 the message crackled back to headquarters. Objective reached, held by 26th Division. Final accounting, 16,000 prisoners, 450 captured guns at a cost of about 7,000 American casualties. And yet, here is the turn the story needs. Because triumph without honesty is just marketing. Most of the German force escaped. General Fuchs pulled his divisions back in good order to the fortified Michel line at the base of the salient. And the following day, when American units probed that fresh, manned, fully alive defensive position, the picture reversed with sickening speed. Soldiers of the 89th Division watched an advance by the neighboring 2nd Division get cut to ribbons by interlocking machine guns and direct artillery fire in front of intact entanglements. Same army, same week, same obstacle, completely different outcome. So the crossing at Saint-Mihiel was not proof that the obstacle was obsolete. Something more specific had failed, and the German officers now sitting in prisoner cages or writing after-action reports behind the Michel line had to explain to themselves what it was. Their explanation is the strangest part of this entire battle because these were not surprised men. They had known the attack was coming. Some of them had effectively read its schedule in a newspaper, and they still cannot account for what had happened at the belts. To see why, we have to stop looking over American shoulders and spend time inside the German defense itself, where a fence can exist on a map for years after it has stopped existing on the ground. Start with who was actually standing behind those entanglements. Army Detachment C under General Georg Fuchs looks substantial on paper. 8 divisions and 2 brigades holding the salient's face. In reality, German divisions by late 1918 averaged fewer than 15,000 men against the 28,000 of an American division. And several of the units here were Landwehr territorial formations, filled with men between 37 and 45 years old, organized to hold static positions and known to show little aggression. Fuchs considered exactly one of his divisions fully reliable. American soldiers advancing through the salient noticed it immediately. Many of the prisoners shuffling past them were old men and young boys, the last scrapings of a manpower barrel Germany had emptied in the spring offensives. The garrison was, in a very real sense, the least dangerous thing about the position. When intelligence warned him the Americans were massing, he issued a declaration to his command that survives in the records. Composite Army C will prepare to repulse these attacks. Read that sentence carefully because its confidence is the whole story. On what was that confidence resting? Not manpower, he didn't have it. Not artillery. Much of it was already rolling toward the rear under the Loki withdrawal order. It rested on the position itself. 3 fortified zones, 4 years of engineering, and above all, the obstacle belts that guaranteed any serious assault would telegraph itself days in advance, leaving ample time to finish the withdrawal or man the line. The entanglements were not just Fuchs's barrier. They were his intelligence service, his clock. Now watch how that clock lied to him twice in one night. First, the 4-hour bombardment. To a German staff officer raised on the arithmetic of the Western Front, a 4-hour preparation could not be the main blow. It was too short to cut the belts, and everyone knew you had to cut the belts. It read as a demonstration, a raid, perhaps a feint tied to that suspicious activity down at Belfort. The defenders were listening honestly and expertly for a signature. The Americans simply weren't transmitting on that frequency. This is why knowing the date from a Swiss newspaper saved no one. The Germans knew when, but their entire system of understanding was built to recognize how, and the how never arrived. Second and deeper, the obstacle itself had quietly changed sides. Here is where we have to think like a farmer instead of a general. Barbed wire is not masonry. It is tension steel and tension is mortal. Rust eats the strands. Frost heaves the pickets. Rain mats the bands into the grass. A fence is not a thing you build. It is a thing you keep. Every farm family in Kansas knew that. And it is a strange poetry of this battle that the 80th D9th Division, drafted largely from Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, attacked entanglements built from an Illinois farmer's invention. The German defense had inventoried its obstacle as a quantity. So many belts, so many meters deep, drawn in confident ink on the situation maps. Nobody was auditing its condition. 4 years of neglect had converted whole stretches of the barrier from an obstacle into a drawing of an obstacle. The Americans did not cross the fence on the German maps. That fence was uncrossable. They crossed the fence that actually existed in the grass, and only one side bothered to find out the difference. This, I think, is the honest answer to the question in this video's title, and it is worth saying plainly. The German defenders could not understand the crossing because they were asking the wrong question. They asked, what weapon got the Americans through the belts? And there was no such weapon. Nothing exotic crossed the entanglements that morning except infantry, walking, cutting on the move, stepping over rusted bands. What actually got crossed was an assumption. The assumption that steel guarantees time, that density equals function, that an enemy must announce himself because every enemy for 4 years had. That experience had made them experts in a pattern. On September 12th, expertise became blindness. You cannot detect the absence of a warning you are certain must come. The German army's own paperwork records the aftershock. A senior commander called the battle a severe defeat for Composite Army C. Assessments that had dismissed the Americans as amateurs were rewritten within weeks to describe tough, dangerous troops. The 5th Division's opponents took to calling its men the Red Devils. But the proof that something systemic, not accidental, had happened at Saint-Mihiel came 2 weeks later, and it came written in American blood. In the Meuse-Argonne and on the Hindenburg Line, the AEF slammed into defenses that were everything Saint-Mihiel's were not. Manned in depth, maintained alive. There, dense networks of fresh entanglements were interlocked with machine gun positions across 4 fortified lines. Defenses so strong the French commander Pétain predicted the Americans would do well to reach the town of Montfaucon before winter. On September 29th, New York's 107th Infantry attacked the Hindenburg Line across ground laced with strands and hidden tunnels, and Germans poured out of those tunnels to gun the attackers down from behind. The regiment's men earned 4 medals of honor in a single day and paid for them. Where the obstacle was kept, where it could still buy its time, it still killed superbly. That contrast is the final exhibit. The belts at Saint-Mihiel did not fail because barbed wire had stopped working. They failed because these particular defenders had stopped working on them and never noticed. If your grandfather or great-grandfather served with the AEF in the 1st, the 26th, the 42nd, the 89th, the 90th, with the engineers or the gunners or the men who carried cutters, I would be honored to read his story in the comments. What unit? What did the family remember him saying about that September? Those details survive nowhere else, and they matter more than any archive. One document from this battle remains, though, a single sentence written by the man who bet 4 hours against 4 years, a sentence that quietly announced the end of an era in warfare, and that almost nobody outside military colleges has ever read. In November 1919, General Pershing submitted his final report on the American war effort, and buried in his account of Saint-Mihiel is the sentence this whole story has been building toward. Reflecting on that morning, he wrote that for the first time, wire entanglements ceased to be regarded as impassable barriers. Read it twice because the phrasing is surgical. He did not claim the barriers were destroyed. He did not claim they were weak. He said they ceased to be regarded. That what changed on September 12th was not the steel in the fields, but the idea in men's heads. And in the same breath, he declared that the doctrine his army had been mocked for preaching, open warfare, infantry that solves obstacles in stride, had just been proven correct in front of the whole world. So let's close the causal chain link by link the way an auditor closes a case. The belts at Saint-Mihiel were never really a wall. They were a machine for buying time. Seconds for the machine gunners, days for the generals, and for 4 years that machine had one price. The attacker had to announce himself to get across. The German defenders staked everything on that price being non-negotiable because it always had been. The Americans looked at the same obstacle and attacked its product instead of its steel. 4 hours of fire instead of 4 days. The announcement never went out. Breaching teams inside the assault waves instead of ahead of them. The cutting, where it happened at all, happened at the speed of the attack itself. And where years of rust and rain had quietly dissolved the barrier into the grass, the infantry did the simplest thing in this entire war. It stepped over. That is why the defenders could not understand it. Not because the method was complicated, because it was insultingly simple, and their own expertise forbade them from seeing it. Every instinct they had built since 1914 was a pattern recognition system tuned to one signature. The long, loud wire cutting overture that preceded every serious attack in their experience. The Americans did not defeat that system. They declined to trigger it. It was not rust alone that beat the Germans. And it was not courage alone either. It was the refusal to announce. Swap that one element back in. Give the defenders their week of warning, and September 12th, 1918 reads like July 1st, 1916. The psalm with American names on the graves. And here is the sentence that should be carved over the entrance of every staff college. If the defenders had audited their own fences the way a Kansas farmer audits his, this battle would be remembered differently. They did not. They defended a drawing. An obstacle you stop maintaining does not stop appearing on your maps. It only stops existing in the field, and it tells no one when it dies. The Germans were not defeated by what the Americans knew about the belts. They were defeated by what they themselves had stopped knowing. None of this was destiny, and none of it was free. 7,000 Americans were killed or wounded in those 4 days. Men who fell in the mud of an easy victory that was only easy compared to the alternative. 2 weeks later, against defenses that were maintained and manned, the same army bled terribly in the Meuse-Argonne, exactly as the mechanism predicts. Saint-Mihiel did not repeal the laws of the Western Front. It exposed the one clause everyone had misread. The obstacle was only ever as strong as the warning it could extract. Remove the warning, and you're no longer fighting the fortress. You are fighting the men. Tired, aging, half-withdrawn men who had been hiding behind its reputation. The battle left fingerprints far beyond 1918. The operations order for Saint-Mihiel was the first in American military history to use two small pieces of planning, shorthand D-Day and H-Hour, coined here in the paperwork for an attack whose whole premise was controlling time. Those terms would return on another morning of crossed obstacles, June 6, 1944, carried by the sons of the men who invented them. Even the officers aged well. The staff planner Marshall, the tank colonel Patton, the brigade commander MacArthur. All standing in the mud of one September battle, all destined to run the next war. Historians still argue about how much of Saint-Mihiel's success the Germans gave away by withdrawing. Fair enough, but no one argues about what the American army learned there, because it wrote the lesson down and never stopped using it. And the men from the opening of this story, the 16,000 walking to the cages, past their own standing entanglements, their bafflement was recorded, absorbed into intelligence files, and largely forgotten. It deserves better than forgetting, because it is one of the purest specimens ever collected of how expertise fails. Not by knowing too little, but by knowing one thing so completely that its absence becomes invisible. They were listening for the only attack they had ever met. The one that came was silent in exactly the register they knew how to hear. The last word, though, should not belong to generals or to doctrine. It belongs to a corporal from the 90th Division, somewhere in the torn ground of the Côte de Meuse. On the morning all of this stopped being theory, Jesse Geesham did not cross without cutting. He was the cutting, the human margin that made the doctrine's arithmetic come out. When the call went down the line for cutters, he climbed out of cover and walked forward into machine gun fire as calmly as a man mending a fence line back home. And he opened one path for his comrades and then another, and died starting the third. The Army gave him the Distinguished Service Cross. History gave him 2 sentences in a government pamphlet. The whole revolution this video has described, the 4-hour bet, the silent crossing, the collapse of a 4-year certainty, walked into Germany through gaps that men like him held open with their hands. If this story changed the way you look at the obstacles in your path, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury, Plant the seeds of the future. The next treasure will be open soon.